there's a growing tension among police and citizens, and not just among the law-breaking class with whom you would expect there to be tension. As affordable technology makes it possible for almost anyone to record any aspect of life, cameras are often trained on police to record their interactions with us, the public. This is not always welcome, however, and police, including close by in the neighboring state of Maryland, are arresting citizens for training their camera phones and helmet cams on officers of the law. Now, some high-minded principles, First Amendment rights, the ability of police to do their jobs, and the interpretations of privacy rights are all in play here. We're going to sort it out tonight, right here on VoiceBox. And joining me for this incredible conversation, we have Kent Willis, who is the Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Virginia.
Good evening.
And we also have, good evening, and we also have Robert Sherman, who is a lawyer with the law firm of Covington and Burling, and as part of that work also represents the National Press Photographers Association.
Good evening, Christian. Thanks for having me.
All right, it's good to see you both, and let it be known to all the VoiceBox audience out there that we did invite representatives from Arlington County Police and also the Virginia State Police to join us for this conversation to have a well-rounded discussion, but they chose not to join us tonight. But that is not going to discourage us from getting into these issues in depth. Now, for a lot of people, watching, they may not have very much involvement with the police, at least we hope not. And when you think about cameras and police, probably the image that comes at least early to people's minds is the infamous Rodney King video, and certainly many people viewed that as a fortunate act because people were able to be prosecuted for their bad conduct. But we're really not talking about that today. It's something altogether very different. So sort of what are the nuances of these current situations that we're seeing in the news all over the place? Why don't we start with you, Rob?
Sure. Well, I think as you mentioned, we're living in an era when opportunities for journalism are greater than they've ever been before. And so I think the big challenge and the big tension that police and journalists are both struggling with is how do we protect civil liberties and freedom of expression in an era where we have legitimate and important security concerns? How do we make sure that we protect our society without going too far across the line and undermining the freedom of expression that's an important part of what we stand for?
Okay. And Kent, civil liberties, as Rob talked about, is this really an issue where we feel that the freedom of the press, so to speak, is somehow being put under attack?
And not just freedom of the press. I mean, let's talk about freedom of speech in general. Rob works with press photographers, but there are lots of other people taking pictures too, and they have a constitutional right to take those pictures. Now, one thing we can get into if we want to is there's some differences here. The right of the press to take a picture is sort of the most protected. The right of the press to write and do inquiry and take these kinds of photographs gets the highest protections under the First Amendment. But individuals, me standing on a street corner taking a picture of a building, people walking by, the police in action, that too is protected by the First Amendment. And as you said, there's a whole issue here. It's new technologies, because before not that many people had video cameras or even cameras. Now everybody has one practically. Heightened security interest. And so this whole question of protecting civil liberties, our fundamental right to express ourselves through photography in this case, is all right here, sort of in this particular issue.
Now, in doing some research for the show, I was just struck by the number of allegations that various folks have had, whether they be ordinary folks, whether they be folks who are part of the media as bloggers or independent freelance photojournalists who have, levied allegations in all parts of the country that by simply taking a picture or recording via video police in action, they have been asked to either cease and desist, or they've had their product confiscated, the images deleted. This seems to happen with such regularity. Is this legal under the law? You seem to say that it's not, but it seems to happen a lot. So what gives?
Well, I think one of the challenges is I don't think it's legal. I don't think that police departments should be interfering with particularly members of the press, but citizens in general when they take photographs. I mean, there's nothing inherent about taking a photograph that I think creates a security risk or certainly is a crime in virtually all instances. And so I think a lot of times, frankly, it's a problem of awareness. I think the police departments aren't necessarily aware of the significant issues that are raised by that conduct, and I think even if the police departments are, in a lot of cases the individual police officers, it just hasn't been a priority of training, and until they get into a situation with a photographer, whether that person is a journalist or not, I think it may not be something that they've just thought a lot about.
In fact, follow up on that, police departments, I think in New York and San Francisco both, in recent months, I believe, actually issued guidelines and memos to police officers saying, allow people to take pictures, because there were so many of these incidences coming up, and it was mostly police acting on their own. You know, they're a sort of new sense of security, and so that they have to prevent citizens from peering into what government is doing. And of course, that blocks government transparency. I mean, if there's one thing we want to know, it's what the government is doing, and in particular, we want to know what the police are doing, because that's the agency of the government that has the most power to infringe on our civil liberties. So you referenced the Rodney King incident, and I remember a few years ago I got a call from a police department in Virginia saying we're thinking about mounting cameras on our cars, and we want to, it wasn't from the police, it was from the media about the police considering this somewhere. And they said, we want to comment from you about how this invades people's privacy rights. And I said, no, I don't think so. I said, no, I think just the opposite. I think the key here, as with a lot of technology, is protocol. If the police are going to take pictures of you, what they should do is take pictures every time, not just selectively when they feel like it, when they're arresting people. And the video cameras should stay on all the time, so they can't turn them off, do something bad, and then turn them back on. But it goes both ways. I mean, if the police have a right to take a picture of you, you have a right to take a picture of them back.
And I think one of the challenges is when photographers are not allowed to take pictures of police doing their job, the implication is that the police have something to hide, which in fact in most instances I don't think that they do. And so as a journalist, your impression, and as a member of the public who's reading or watching what a journalist is producing, your assumption is there's some reason why the police don't want me to see what they're doing. And I certainly don't think that's a good thing either for the police department or for society.
Okay. Now, it sounds simple to hear you two talk about it, but in fact, a lot of these incidences that have occurred across the country, it's not just the police arresting individuals, it's prosecutors actually following through and charging and trying and going through the whole judicial process. So is the law as settled as you two suggest, or do we see variations in interpretation throughout the country?
Well, I think there are variations in interpretation. Certainly prosecutors have taken steps that are more aggressive than we think is appropriate. You referenced a situation in Maryland in your introduction in which somebody was actually arrested for violation of a wiretap act. And the Maryland Attorney General actually, in what we think is a very favorable development, recently concluded that the wiretap act does not, in fact, in his view, restrict recording of citizen police interactions. So I think, certainly the government does not always agree, but I think it's pretty clear that limiting somebody's ability to take a photograph simply for that isn't constitutional.
Okay.
Yeah. And even when and you talk about prosecutions, because that's what's the scariest of all, but I think what happens most of the time is police have a tendency to assert their authority when they are dealing with individuals, and where we've seen authority they don't necessarily have. A good example of this is a police officer stops you in your car for speeding or something like that, and he says, I want to can I search your trunk? And you're on I-95. What do? You actually can say, you don't have a right to search my trunk without exigent circumstances or a warrant. But what are you going to do in that circumstance? And how many people know what their rights are in those circumstances? I think the same thing applies to things like cameras. A lot of police officers, security officers and the like come up to people who are taking pictures and say, you can't do that. And people don't know. I mean, they don't know what their rights are and aren't. And even when they do, as you could say in some cases, as you can see in some cases, the police actually go ahead and make arrest. Another issue that's related to this, of course, and this is something to do with I mean, we have technological developments in society related to the number of cameras that are available. But the other thing we have is more and more what I would call hybrid spaces. It used to be, see, there's sort of rules for private space. You clearly can't go into someone's yard and take their picture without their permission. And then there's public space. I can stand on a street corner and take a picture most of the time. But there are a lot of spaces now that are not so clear. And there was a recent incident in Silver Spring, Maryland, about someone was up there in a downtown development. And I don't know the development well enough to describe it, but it appeared to be a downtown. There were cars, there were stoplights, there were people walking. He was taking pictures. A security guard said, "You can't take pictures here." And this was a retail development. Come to find out, the whole area was actually privately owned, funded with millions of dollars from taxpayers, but privately owned, and therefore he didn't have the same right to take pictures as you might in what we call a public forum, like a sidewalk or a public park.
Now, you're invited to join this conversation if you're watching VoiceBox either at home or online, and you can send an email to voicebox@arlingtonmedia.org. I certainly want to get into the whole public and private spaces and get into all sorts of privacy issues, but sort of, first, Kent, you sort of talked about, you're on I-95 and the police want to search your car, and you certainly have legal rights that are available to you. I want to ask about the prudence question. Principles are one thing, but if a police officer asks you to do something, to what extent should there be the responsibility on the part of you, the individual, to reasonably comply?
Well, we do a lot of work, certainly, with individual photojournalists, and we talk to them about exactly that issue. And each of the photojournalists that talks with us, they understand what their rights are, and they understand where the line is between what the police can reasonably do and what they can't. But we also tell them, in the first instance, the police are the ones that have a responsibility to protect, to control order, and we don't want a situation in which certainly there gets to be a physical altercation between a journalist and the police. We also don't want, if there is an emergency situation, a journalist to be interfering with the police's effort to limit or address that emergency. And so we certainly tell our clients, the photojournalists, that they should comply, they should assert their rights, but when it comes down to it, if the police tell them to do something, they should do it. And I think one of the challenges is, along with that advice, the fact that we don't want photojournalists getting in the way of police protecting public safety is a responsibility for the police, because unlike a lot of things that police might tell you to stop doing, they might tell you to stop speeding, for example, when they tell you don't take pictures, or when they take your film or your memory card away, that actually prevents you from ever having that moment again. And if you're a journalist, it prevents you from conveying to the public what happened in that moment. And so in many instances, it's possible to go back later and say, well, we think you violated this wiretap law, so we're going to punish you for that. That's very different from a police officer coming in and saying to a journalist, you can't take pictures now, or I'm going to require you to delete the pictures that you've already taken. So I do think it's a two-way street, but certainly journalists do need to be respectful, and they shouldn't be causing further escalation of the incidents that they're covering.
All right, now, that's how Rob advises the people that he works with. Kent, do you say the same thing holds true for individuals?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can be less cautious about this. On the other hand, the ACLU is not about to advise anybody to confront the police on these issues. There are too many potential downsides to that Rob just described. I think the key when a situation like this happens is for the person to be aware of what happened. I mean, they should ask. They should say, I think I have this right. There's nothing wrong with speaking to a police officer, and there's nothing wrong with asserting what you believe your rights are. But if the police officer insists, you probably ought to do what the police officer says. But then there are other things you can do. First of all, every time an incident like this happens, it needs to be recorded. There needs to be a complaint about it. It needs to be used to educate the police officer, because more than likely in a situation where someone is standing on a street corner taking a picture, they can do it, even if the police says they are interfering with something. What you want to do is know who that police officer is. You want to complain to his or her superior. You want to contact an organization like the ACLU. The key with this issue is, to some extent, what we're doing right here is talking about it so that everybody gets educated. And the most important people to be educated right now are police officers and security guards who really don't seem to quite understand this. It's my sense from the large number of complaints we've gotten in Virginia over the last several years that security guards and police really haven't been given real good guidelines on this, and if you let them rely on their instincts, or their discretion to do this, they're going to tend toward the law enforcement, keep everything safe and distant, and don't mess with me approach. So they need to be educated.
And Ken, I want to just highlight one thing that you said that I think is really important from the perspective of the work that we do with the NPPA. Knowing about these incidents when they happen is just critical to our ability to make sure, to educate both the police and members of the public about the importance of these issues. I think, you know, when we've had some great success actually in working with police departments. Most recently, we've worked with transit police in New York and New Jersey and Amtrak police as well in establishing policies that we think are more measured and that reflect both the public safety interest and the public expression interest. And I think the only way that we've been able to do that as effective as we have, of course, a lot of police departments don't ask the public what they think when these things happen. But the only reason that people have been willing to pay attention to this issue is because it happens, because we can say this is a big deal. It happens on a regular basis to photojournalists.
Right.
Now, remember, you can join this conversation by sending in your email question or comment to voicebox@arlingtonmedia.org. Ken, you also sort of talked about you know, the ACLU's position when cameras on cruisers was sort of an emerging issue, and about how you wanted to ensure that the cameras were kept on at all times so that they recorded the totality of an incident, not just selected snippets. Well, in fact, I've heard from law enforcement that that's part of the concern that they have with the proliferation of citizen photojournalists as well as professional photojournalists. And you know, even if you look at an egregious or seemingly egregious case like San Francisco, where the I can't remember if it was a police officer or a private security guard, but who actually shot someone and killed them on the BART transit system. The video shows some pretty compelling stuff, but we don't see the totality of what happened in the minutes before the suspects were apprehended, and we certainly don't see very much after the situation. Is that a problem that sort of tilts the balance a little bit more in what some police officers are saying in terms of this is not exactly a good thing to allow unfettered photo and video access for the public?
Well, I think it's absolutely important to know who your source is, who's providing the photograph to you, and whether you trust them to give you a full and accurate account of what happened. I think that's important anytime you're looking at a photograph. But the response to that, the solution to the problem of knowing who's giving you information is not, let's just not allow anybody to convey information or take photographs. It's to provide more information. It's to say, you know, we trust, for example, the Washington Post to give us information about what the police do in Washington. If it's something on a blog that I found from a blogger that I don't know, I may be a little bit more critical, and certainly the police department can put out its own information about what happened. But I think it's a very serious and very troubling reaction to say, well, we don't know how responsible everybody's going to be in reporting what happened, so we're just not going to let anybody report what happened at all.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we can hold the government to a different standard. I mean, the government is ours, and it needs to be transparent, and we have a right, with the exception of a few circumstances determined by law, to know what's going on in the government, including police interactions with people. On the other hand, I should be able to take a photograph of something that's going on, a partial video. I can use that. I can put that on YouTube or whatever, but nothing's going to happen as a result of that. Now, if something like that it's different to how it's used. It's one thing for me to put it on YouTube or for me to put it on the internet somewhere and for maybe it to be used to draw the wrong conclusion about what happened. That's citizens expressing their opinion in a way, even if it's not a full opinion. But it's another thing if that information is going to be used for some sort of prosecution against the police. Then it's subject to all kinds of legal standards. And so you can say, here's a partial video I took of something that went on, and I'm going to use this as a basis for a prosecution against this police officer. Well, that police officer has full protection of due process of law. He has lawyers to argue that it's incomplete. He'll have witnesses to argue whatever else happened and so on. And that's something for a court to decide. But I think that's different from the right to take the picture in the first place and the right to use the picture, even if it does have a slightly distorting view. But everybody knows lots of videos, that's exactly what makes them interesting, is they don't show the full picture. But I have a right to do that. I have a right to take those pictures. I have a right to put them up. I have a right to be critical of police officers. I have a right to have my opinion of police officers. What I can't do is take any kind of legal action against that police officer without the law coming into play, and that sort of creates a more level playing field.
But, assuming that these rights are, as you all express, fairly clear, at least in favor of citizens being able to, within reasons, and we'll get into exceptions through some scenarios I throw at you a little bit later, to record police interactions. Is it responsible? Even if the rights are there, is it responsible? Particularly, sure, you may not be able to successfully prosecute a police officer based on a citizen video that's posted on YouTube, but it very well may sour the public's perception of the trustworthiness or the professionalism of that particular officer or that particular force. And in a way, I can kind of see the viewpoint that, well, it really doesn't matter what happens in a court of law. The court of public opinion has already spoken, and we had an unfair disadvantage there. Any validity to that fear?
I think there's validity to the fear, but I think certainly people have other things that limit what they say, other than just a police officer telling them you can't say this or you can't report on this information. And one of those things is if I go on TV right now and I say awful things about you that aren't true, or cast things in a way that makes you look like you did something that you didn't do, you could sue me and you could get damages from me. And that's something that happens after the fact that encourages journalists and others to be responsible in the way that they report. But I think, again, the solution isn't just telling people that they can't take pictures or can't see things in the first place.
Yeah, I think in general, the solution is almost never to prevent people from doing things, expressing themselves. The solution is more expression. I mean, the more people that are out there, the more people that are watching the government, the more accountable the government is. And I think it's just something that comes with the job. If you're a public official, you were talking about being sued for libel, let's say. If you're a public official, the standard's a little different. If I'm doing it against you as a private citizen, that's one thing. But if I'm expressing my opinion, even if it's wrong, against the president, for example, I have broad First Amendment rights to do that. And that includes the same. If a police officer aggravates me, I get to say he aggravated me. And that's part of just what comes with the job, I think. And in the end, though, it's this question about which is the best way to go. And I think Rob expressed that, and I'm going to agree with that the best way to go is sort of the more expression or the more opportunity to see what the government is doing, the better, even if sometimes it's a slightly painful process for some people.
And certainly, with this, we're seeing, in addition, Rob, to the many, photojournalists who have come forward with concerns about this issue, we're just seeing story after story of ordinary folks, whether they be, guys riding motorcycles with helmet cams, or, a single mother with a camera phone. We're hearing of all sorts of folks who have been subject to confiscation of their equipment and deleting the records, and in some cases brutality in an effort to force compliance. So, for individuals who are walking, who have all of this technology and who are going about their daily lives, what level of risk do you think they face, sort of just taking pictures of life as it occurs? Or is this just a problem that's magnified by the high-profile cases that we've seen reported? Or is this a big widespread concern?
Well, I think it's becoming more widespread, again, because the technology to take these photographs is becoming more widespread. And so I think, we certainly hear about many of the cases where this happens, and as Ken points out, not all of them. So I think it's something that individuals should be worried about, particularly as more individuals are able to publish their thoughts. They're able to go on the internet and have an audience and tell people what they think. But I also think we shouldn't overstate the risk. We shouldn't overstate the risk that if I go out on Clarendon Boulevard and take a photograph, that somehow creates a terrorism threat or some other security concern. It's not the fact that I took the picture that creates that concern. It's what I might do later, and there are obviously other remedies for that, but it's not the photograph that's the concern in my view.
You know, an example of this is Virginia has something called a fusion center. Most states have them now. These are these state, federal entities that collect data for looking at potential terrorist risk in usually in states, but actually some states have several. The Virginia Fusion Center released its report, didn't release its report actually, but its report was released and got online. We obtained a copy of it and looked at it very carefully. Now, this is a report of data brought in through the Virginia State Police, local police, citizens reporting, and the FBI, and a report saying what is the risk of terrorism in Virginia. And it's a sophisticated report in a lot of ways. But one of the things that really struck me about it is there's a whole section on photographing infrastructure. And it's about how they see that as they're tracking incidences of people photographing infrastructures, and they're looking at the numbers. More and more people are photographing that. So there must be something suspicious about that activity. I think it's an entirely wrong assumption on their part. The number one concern in the report of people taking pictures was the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. I think that most people taking pictures of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel probably just crossing it, sort of struck by the beauty of the opening of the James River into the Chesapeake Bay. Yet they are now part of a report on potential terrorist activities. And that's an indication of how our society is beginning to feel about these things. And it goes to your question about you know, what is the risk? None of these people, or a few of these people actually detained. There was a Muslim who was taking a picture of the bridge tunnel, and he actually was detained and searched. And of course, intersecting any issue like this, of course, is always the issue of race, ethnicity, religion, but that we don't really need to deal with that here, because that's always there in any kind of government, particularly police activity. There's always going to be some discrimination based on race or nationality. And of course, if you're taking pictures of any place, if you are a racial minority, you're probably more likely to get stopped than if you're not, and particularly if you appear to be Arabic or Muslim at this point.
I'm going to get you guys back in the business of giving free legal advice, knowing again that you're not a lawyer, Ken, but Ken, you don't have to be. You know, there's a question comes in from Brian over email. How should you respond if the police confiscate your media or demand that you delete your media? What should you as an individual, you're faced with the situation, what should you do?
Well, I should say I am a lawyer and I can't give free legal advice. I'll tell you what I would do. And I think each person, in all honesty, has to consider the situation. They have to decide what they're comfortable with, and people will handle that situation in different ways. I think what I would do is what Ken alluded to earlier, which is I would tell the police officer that I didn't want to delete my media or delete my photos, turn over my memory card, and I would tell them why in a respectful way. I think if they insisted that I do it or threatened to arrest me if I didn't, I think I'd turn it over and deal with it later, and I think I would raise the issue with the Virginia ACLU or the National Press Photographers Association if I'm a journalist or something like that. I personally wouldn't be comfortable escalating the situation and getting into a physical confrontation with a police officer. But again, you know, everybody handles that situation differently.
I agree with the lawyer.
Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting. I've looked at some of these cases, and in fact, people did as you suggested, or didn't and had it deleted forcefully by the police, but were able to use, I guess there's recovery software that allows you after the fact to, I guess, retrieve what was apparently deleted. So, you know, I'm even wondering about the efficacy of the demand in the first place if we have that kind of technology available. You know, it doesn't seem to be successful.
I'm not familiar with the technology, but it's a fair point.
Yeah, yeah. We also have another question that comes in, and it really concerns the fears that you alluded to, Kent. We live in an age where people are concerned about terrorism, and people who have children are concerned often about predators. And, you know, how do our First Amendment protections that you all, you know, view fairly clearly sort of how do they stand when it butts up against people's real concerns about safety, and not just individual safety, but collective safety, and the person who's photographing children at a playground, or the person who seems to be oddly fixated with the infrastructure of a subway system? You know, how do we deal with that?
Well, I think one of the first things to remember is that the First Amendment protections, like most constitutional protections, are not absolute. There actually are limitations. There are the government, and most typically the example, the government has a compelling reason to restrict something you're doing, and they have a way of doing it so that it doesn't sort of cast the net too broadly. It's kind of a narrowly tailored kind of thing. Then the government can create laws that restrict these kinds of activities. I mean, here's an example. A few years ago in Virginia, this is about 10 years ago, someone was taking pictures. We got a complaint from nurses in a hospital that someone was taking, they discovered a video camera in their dressing room. Now it ends up the hospital thought there was some equipment was missing, so they hired a security, this was a public hospital, hired a security firm that very amateurishly apparently put this camera in the ceiling of their dressing room. The nurses found it after it had been there a few days, and they came to us, and we couldn't find a Virginia law that made this illegal. And there were arguments you could make about this, sort of general privacy, but we couldn't find a Virginia law. We went to the Virginia General Assembly, and if you look, you'll see a law passed about 1996 or 97 in Virginia that says you can't videotape someone in a place where they have an expectation of privacy. That's a sort of logical and legitimate law, and it was one that was way behind the technology. It should have been passed a long time ago. So you can have things like that. In other words, situations where you can limit the kinds of pictures that are taken and where. What can people do? You used an example of a suspicious-looking character. Well, there's nothing that prevents someone from going to the police and saying, there's a suspicious-looking character in my neighborhood. There's a guy that's been hanging out with a camera. And the police, you know, they can then decide whether it's something worth acting on. And now they're in this situation. Here's someone standing on a sidewalk with a camera, which they have a right to do. More than likely, even if it's sort of an oddball doing this, if they haven't already been in trouble with the law and are on probation or something like that, they can stand there on that sidewalk and take that picture even if they're a bit odd. But you know, people get together, they know how to protect themselves. There are things the law can do when there's a basis for doing it. But generally speaking, the idea is you protect people's right to do things like take photographs. And so we need to lean in that direction.
Now, but don't police have the right to question you, ask you what you're doing? That's happened to me, not with photographs, but I've often been, not often, don't want to give our viewers the wrong impression, but I've on occasion been asked what I'm doing in a particular circumstance or situation, and upon answering satisfactorily, there's been no further action on their part. Don't they have that right? Yeah,
police have the right to come up to you and ask any question you want. The issue is whether you have to answer them or not. And if you're standing on a street corner doing nothing wrong, and a police officer comes up and says, "Why are you here?" You can say, "Listen, I'm just standing on the street corner. I don't have to answer your question. I don't even have to identify myself." If the police officer, however, has reason to believe that you are committing a criminal act or about to commit a criminal act, it's called a Terry stop, then they have a right actually to detain you, ask you your name, and even search you if it looks like you have a weapon, something that might cause danger to them. But just standing on a street corner, you have a right to be there, and you don't have to answer the police. Again, though, you have to make the decision about whether you want to confront that police officer in that situation.
And I would say if you're standing on the corner taking a photograph, Christian, and a police officer comes up to you and says, "It looks like you're taking a photograph of something that I'm not comfortable with you taking a photograph of," I mean, they certainly have the right to answer that question. And as Kent says, you have the right to decide whether you want to answer or not. Where, in my view, the police officer crosses a line is when they do something that prevents you from taking the picture, when they do something that interferes with your ability to do what it is that you're doing. I work most frequently with journalists, obviously, not with members of the public, but I mean, particularly, as a journalist, when you take a photograph and publish it, you're essentially conveying your experience of what happened in a particular moment to the rest of the people who are in your audience. And by the police, instead of just saying, no, you can't take instead of the police asking what you're doing, and you can say, I'm a journalist and I'm taking a photograph, when they actually go the next step and stop you from doing it or try to take back your media or whatever the case may be, that's where the problem comes in. But there's certainly no problem with the police asking unobtrusively questions.
Well, let's get, a lot of this is about details, and we've got a great email question from David, who wants to know, are there different standards or sensitivities even for the different forms of recording technology out there? Is video technology viewed the same way as photo technology? And I know in the state of Maryland, often this is really not about the video recording, it's the audio portion of the record of the incident. What differences do these various forms of media have, both legally and practically?
Well, I think legally you've identified the biggest one, which is in cases where the police or the prosecutors would try to go after somebody for a wiretap violation, which again we don't think, and I'm sure Kent would agree with me, that's not the right way to go after somebody if you think that they've done something wrong. But I think that arises out of the audio portion of a video recording, and so if you're just taking still photographs, it's less likely to raise those issues. Now the police might come up with another theory, I don't know. I think just intuitively, and I should say from a First Amendment perspective, I don't think there's a difference.
Okay.
I think if you're going to take photographs, regardless of whether they're videos or still photographs, I think you have the same rights and those still apply. I could imagine, although I don't know for sure, that police might be more sensitive in the area of video, obviously because it collects more information than a still, but that's just sort of a guess on my part.
Right, right. So let's talk about Maryland for a little bit, since it is our immediate neighbor, and the wiretapping statute with Beltway denizens may remember that was applied most famously, I guess, with the Linda Tripp, Monica Lewinsky case. But I guess the whole idea there is in Maryland, you can't surreptitiously record someone, and obviously without their consent. And so the issue with some of these recent cases in Maryland is, well, if an officer is telling me not to record it, then clearly it's not a surreptitious recording. So how does that apply to the wiretap standard? Help us sort it out. Like, I know you don't believe that it's a proper application of the law, but is this something that's a no-brainer? It seems kind of simple.
Well, I'll tell you, the Maryland Attorney General, from what I've heard, has taken the position that it's not appropriate, and the reason is because police officers don't have an expectation of privacy in a traffic stop in that situation. So it's the same as if I were recording something that went on in public versus taking a picture in a locker room of a hospital, for example. I think those are very different situations, and I wouldn't have a reason to object if I'm just walking down the street and somebody's recording what I'm doing. It may make me uncomfortable, but it's a very different situation from when I'm getting dressed for work, for example.
And by the way, something most people don't know, you just described the the Maryland law. The Virginia law is different. In Virginia, if a third party can't listen in on two parties who don't know about it. Okay. But if one of the two parties is recording it, they don't have to tell the other person. In other words, I can call you on the phone and record our conversation in Virginia, and that's legal. In Maryland, I can't call you on the phone and record our conversation without you knowing about it. And so I don't know about the district, but this kind of thing actually varies from state to state.
Yeah, I guess there are two. My research said that there were two states that really don't allow it at all, and I guess there are about 20 or so that do as Maryland does, and doesn't allow for one party to surreptitiously record the other. And then you've got, I guess, the remainder are more like Virginia, which says it's okay.
Right.
So we have another email question, and it really it goes back to this whole issue of what should the individual response be if you're confronted with a scenario. Shouldn't you just keep the video private and not post it on social media like YouTube? Would this be less of an issue? Would we not be having this show if we didn't have sort of the social media proliferation where everybody knew about this stuff, often instantaneously? Or do you think that that's somehow helpful?
Well, I think it's an important question.
Yeah.
And I think it's an important question not only for us here, but for journalists and for people who think about what they should put on YouTube or publish in the newspaper or on television. But I think you have to make a judgment about what's appropriate. I think we wouldn't be having this conversation if people didn't publish things in the newspaper or on YouTube, not because it wouldn't be a problem, but because we wouldn't know there was an issue. And I think Kent has pointed out this, and I think it's very important. One of the functions that publicity, whether it's this television show or a YouTube posting or a blog or a newspaper serves, is it lets us, those of us who weren't there to witness a particular thing, know that it happened. So yes, absolutely, people should use discretion and decide. They shouldn't necessarily post every single thing that they see on YouTube. I think people should be respectful, but I don't think that the solution is not to post things and to keep everything that you see private. I think there's a huge benefit in letting people in the world know what you've seen.
Mm-hmm. So we've got another question coming from email. How do they decide when people are gathering news versus regular civilians? And really, is there a difference?
Well,
you talked earlier about
right.
sort of the rights for journalists being, somewhat more, I guess, sacrosanct, but these rights applying to all. Kind of, does this make a difference what your purpose and intent is?
Well, yeah, it can, but I think it's a matter of degree. And when we're talking about the protections for journalists, and Rob can certainly speak to this better than I can, what we're really talking about is the courts interpreting the First Amendment of the Constitution. And the kinds of cases that go before them really have been more about journalists and the press. And the courts have generally come down strongly on the side of freedom of the press. Because they consider that, they know that's sort of an essential, fundamental ingredient of our culture. And so that gets highly protected. And part of it is about messaging. See, press always, the most protected kind of speech is speech that conveys a message. So my right to just say gobbledygook isn't as well protected as my right to say vote for a certain candidate. And so it's the press that sort of automatically you assume that they are doing this for a purpose, and it's for a public purpose to do it, so they're going to get the highest degree of protection. But if you're standing on a street corner taking a photograph, those kinds of nuances of the law may not have a lot of meaning to you. I'd like to think that, no, I know that to some degree all these First Amendment protections apply to anyone in a public place. It's just that if it comes down to a nuance of facts, where a court is trying to decide which one's protected and not protection, the person doing it for the press is going to get a little more leeway than the person who's doing it merely for personal purposes.
I think this question is really one of the most difficult ones that courts and policymakers are struggling with, because years ago, when you didn't have the internet, it was pretty easy to tell who was a journalist. You had a credential that was given to you by the New York Times or the Washington Post. Excuse me. And so I think in those cases, it was easy for governments, police officers, to know this person's a journalist, this person's not. And we can talk about what that means in terms of First Amendment protections. But today, two things have changed. First, the internet, obviously. But second, news organizations are no longer employing as many photojournalists. Yeah. And so what happens is, whereas 10 or 15 years ago, you used to be an employee of a news organization, now very often they're independent and they're hired for specific projects, or in fact, the news organizations will buy their photographs on a story-by-story basis. And so what that means is, if I'm a photojournalist, I may not have a credential given to me by the Washington Post or the Washington Times. I may instead just be working as a journalist and hoping to sell my photo later. And in my view, that doesn't make me any less of a journalist, but it does make it more difficult for the government to draw that line, and I think more important for the government to be respectful of all photographers.
Now, what about the concern that many in the police community have, and part of it's certainly almost an inarguable fact. It's not likely you're going to find many YouTube videos that show police officers routinely doing their business in a correct and professional way. What's going to get posted and what's going to go viral are the cases of egregious disregard. So what about the concern that this skews the public perception of how police officers perform? It erodes the public trust in police, that undermines our collective security, that you know, legal issues not put aside, but placed in their own box, we have another concern that's not being addressed, and that is sort of the erosion of the civilian police cooperative sort of ethic.
Yeah. You know, what I would say with that is, you know, fight fire with fire, fight photos with photos, or videos with videos. In other words, you know, err to the side of allowing people to take pictures. The police, the government, has the authority and the resources to do its own promotions. In other words, it can fight this by saying, here's what we do. You know, and that's what we say all the time when people complain about these. So, well, you know, don't fight the problem that you're being exposed by censoring someone. Fight it by giving your own version of it. And that's the best way for all of us. Remember, there's this whole notion of transparency, and it's so important in our society. The more government sort of shuts down on us, the less we know about them, the more frightening government becomes to us, the less we trust them, even when they're doing a very good job. And this doesn't involve photos so much, but there was a recent incident in Fairfax County, November of last year. An unarmed motorist was shot and killed by a police officer. And
I remember that.
Yeah, and the police did an internal investigation and said the officer acted properly in the line of duty. They never released the name of the officer. They never released any of the details. All we know is an unarmed person got shot by a police officer, and there have actually been citizens groups forming in Fairfax County trying to get to this information and try to make the police more transparent. I don't know what happened in that instance. I would say probably most of these incidences, the police did act within their authority, and if they released a report or a photo or video or whatever, that they would actually gain more public trust than they would lose. On occasion, they're going to do it wrong, and they're going to have to face up to that. But most of the time, if they release the information and show how they're operating, then they will gain more public trust rather than lose it.
Well, I think we are running out of time, and I think a great question to close is really kind of where this is in the arena of the courts. How much of this is settled law? How much of this do we have yet to see? And we've talked about how states view this issue very differently. Is there the possibility that we could see some overriding federal legislation to sort of deal with these issues, or will they remain, you know, sort of the domain of each and every state?
Well, I think just to answer the overall question, I think the U.S. Supreme Court has been pretty consistent in concluding that journalists and members of the public do have a First Amendment right to take photographs and to engage in that activity. And so I think that aspect of it, in my view, is pretty settled.
Okay.
Where there's less clarity is on the question that we discussed before about who is a journalist and under what circumstances will they get those protections. And Congress has been considering legislation both on sort of access issues, getting access to take photographs in public places and in government places, and also reporter shield laws and those sorts of things. So that continues to be an effort that's very important on the federal level, but I think absolutely it continues to be important at the state level as well.
And Kent, where do you see sort of the legal test for this coming?
If you start to look at there haven't been a whole lot of cases. Mostly have had these instances of intimidation. I think what we're going to see, if there's a proliferation of these kinds of cases, prosecutions, like in Maryland, is that by the time it gets higher up, you know, you have an individual police officer acting who's not really following policy or the law, and so it goes up a few steps, and the attorney general or the police chief says he didn't do it right, we're withdrawing the prosecution. I think you're going to see a few more, or maybe a lot more of those, but that'll begin to settle out as the government essentially loses those cases. And you also alluded to you know, the Congress is actually thinking a lot more about this than it has in the past. There's a resolution right now, and I don't know if it's one of them you were referencing, that literally says you have a right to photograph a police officer doing his duty. And that's a direct reaction to some of the things that have happened around here.
Absolutely.
And that's in Congress right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's something that will clearly clarify it under federal law, at least.
Wow. So, you know, I talked about the trust issue from the perspective of the police, but let's talk about it in the time that we have left from the perspective of the public. And to what extent do you think hearing about these incidents in the paper erode the public's trust in police authority, in the government's authority? Do you think we have anything to fear about, you know, what are the repercussions if all of a sudden citizens lose faith in the professionalism and fairness of our governing bodies?
Well, look, as I walk down the street every day, when I walk to work, I trust that the police are going to do what they're supposed to be doing. I trust that they're going to respect my rights and that they're going to protect me if I'm in danger. These instances create a question about whether the police are doing what they should be doing to protect my rights. I mean, certainly the worst way to look at it is that they have something to hide. I'd like to think that they don't, and they just are concerned about protecting safety and security. But I think certainly the more instances that come out of police interfering with people's ability to be where they want to be in public places or take photographs or report on the news, it makes you question why the government is doing what it's doing. But I still like to think that the government and that police officers are working in my best interest. Mm.
Well, you know, I read a quote from a police chief, I believe in Philadelphia, who advises his officers to act as if there are cameras on you at all times.
Yeah.
That's the way you should go about doing your job. It sounds like you all would suggest that that's good advice.
It's the perfect advice. I mean, not just for police officers, for all of government. It should be operating as if we, the people, are always watching them, because they're there for us.
And, you know, I want to sort of get back to when this goes horribly wrong. You know, you look at the case in Maryland, which I know has gotten a lot of regional and national attention, and what's often lost in that case is that the gentleman who I guess is subject to the wiretap charge was actually breaking the law, recklessly driving his motorcycle. So we're not talking about a completely innocent bystander there. But seemingly some of these cases that have been in the news seem to suggest that occasionally this goes very, very wrong. And you know, again, go back to the San Francisco incident where you know, the officer, I guess, alleges that he intended to shoot his taser, but found his gun instead, and it was an unfortunate accident. And my question is this: you know, let's assume or presume that that officer's right, that this was just an unfortunate accident. What's the danger that this is now memorialized and recorded, and millions of people have now seen what in effect was a police officer you know, murdering another individual? Is that anything that we can deal with here, or do these First Amendment principles just supersede those concerns?
Well, I don't know the specifics of that case. But I think in general, you know, the fact that we know about this and that we can see the process working as it should is a good thing for society, and it's a good thing, frankly, for the police department. When they conduct a thorough investigation, they determine what happened, and whatever needs to happen in terms of corrective measures does take place. I think that's a good thing, and I think the fact that it's not done in a closed back room somewhere, but instead in a place where members of the San Francisco community and Americans more generally can see it, I think that absolutely helps us, and it helps restore or promote our faith in the fact that the government is operating the way it should.
I think the scenario you described is better than the one I described in Fairfax County. Ultimately for everyone, both the police and the public, even though it's a police officer apparently caught in the process of making a terrible, terrible and tragic error.
Right.
It still benefits the public and the police ultimately much better than hiding what happened altogether.
And you know, getting back to sort of some of these scenarios that may make people uncomfortable, has this really ever come up against issues relating to terrorism? Really, I know this is a concern people have articulated, but has this been sort of a practical occurrence that you know of where terrorist activity or suspected terrorist activity was thwarted because a police officer proactively tried to stop the recording or photographing of particular buildings or infrastructure?
I don't really know of any incidences. I look at the Virginia Fusion Center terrorist report, because that was this significantly in-depth report, even if it was one that we felt went in all the wrong directions. Right. And all I can conclude from that report is that over and over again, police are more and more police are suspecting us of doing wrong because they believe that's what they need to do to protect us from terrorists. The report in Virginia, for example, reported that in 2008 there were 432 terrorist actions in Virginia, they believe, although they didn't stop any of them and nothing happened as a result. I mean, somebody's not thinking about this as clearly as they should be. And that lack of clarity, all in the wake of 2001, we are still nervous about what happened in 2001, and all of this is related to that. And I think that affects the kinds of conclusions this report came to. It's affected the police. I believe that it's not just the proliferation of cameras and the internet. This intersects with the post-2001 world, which is the reason we're seeing so many more of these incidences. Police are nervous about security, and they're not well informed about what people's rights are and what the practical effects are of what they're doing. And so their tendency, sort of in reacting on their own, is to shut people out and to shut them down. And that's why we're seeing these kinds of incidences.
And I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is correct legal thinking or rational thinking at all, but you know, someone artfully juxtaposed this issue with, you know, what everyone who's watched Law & Order certainly knows, you know, Miranda rights for an accused to remain silent, otherwise the information can be used, in fact, against them. And the juxtaposition in their minds being, this is, why should that not apply to police officers when they are interacting with the public? If certainly a suspect can have every utterance used against them, shouldn't every action and utterance by a police officer be subject to scrutiny and review? Is that sort of where ultimately, you know, aside from the legal issues, is that where you all sort of see practically this being in play? That, you know, police have the right to use anything against you, you have the right to use anything against them?
Well, I don't see it quite that way, but I do see that, you know, police are operating in a public forum. Police are operating in public, and that's the nature of their jobs. As Kent said, that's kind of what they signed up for. And I think it's important for us, as the police are doing the job for us and working in public, for us to know what they're doing. And I think that's perfectly appropriate.
And what about, and we're going to get off in just a second on this, but what about the concern that police have that some of their business, even if it's conducted seemingly in public, is often designed to be not in the public view. There are conversations with informants, you know, what may be surveillance that shouldn't have attention brought to it. Things that are not necessarily always obvious to someone who may see the police seemingly in the line of duty. Does that sort of change how you all view this?
Not for me. I mean, because it's just as I said before, these rights aren't absolute. So police have a right to conduct undercover investigations. You don't have a right to interfere with those kinds of investigations. And in fact, one of the issues about police accountability it has to do with access to records, and different states have different laws about this. In Virginia, you more or less can't get any police records even after the investigation is closed and finished. One of the things that we've argued for is a law in the Virginia General Assembly that will require police to show to the public investigations once they've been closed. They don't have to give you the details of an investigation while it's ongoing, because that can jeopardize the investigation. But once it's done, then it gets shared with the public, and and then you can know about it. So there's always a balance there, and police do get to do a lot of things in secret. But when they're operating out in the public, just out there on the street doing things, they're in the public, you're in the public, you can photograph them, they can photograph you.
Well, listen, unfortunately, that's going to have to be the last word. Rob, I apologize for not giving you a chance to say a final say. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode of Voice Box. Big issues, high-minded issues. Hopefully you pay attention, and hopefully we can all be safer as a result. Thanks a lot for joining us.